Hey y'all, I'm Corbin from the CoderPad team. Today we're going to be joined by Yuri from the Narwhal team to talk a little bit more about Narwhal and NX and monorepos and what they are and when to use them. Narwhal is, of course, the team behind NX, which is one of the big monorepo tools. And recently they've taken over stewardship of Lerna, which is another monorepo tool that's been widely used in the JavaScript ecosystem. So I'm excited to have him on as a guest today, and let's get going. Yuri, thanks so much for joining us. How you doing?
Thanks, doing great. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. So, lots of exciting stuff going on your end. I guess before we dive into all the exciting stuff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Yuri. I'm from Northern Italy, working with now already a couple of years. I'm also part of the NX core team there. And most recently, I've joined the role of Director of Developer Experience there. So I'm mostly in charge of DevRel stuff and creating content, making sure that DX is good in NX. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was looking through your list of blog posts the other day, and I swear I just had to keep clicking the next page, next page, next page. Like it was seemingly an endless list of great NX tutorials.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so you're clearly doing some great stuff. I guess some early questions that I'm sure viewers are going to have is like, first of all, like what is a monorepo? And then we can kind of dive in, like once we have like this established baseline, kind of like what the benefits of using a monorepo are, and kind of like where NX and Lerna fit into things. Kind of
hmm
going from
hmm
there.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, monorepo, I'm actually not super happy with the term. I was it confuses a lot of folks, right? So a monorepo, I define it as when you have at least two or more applications or libraries within a same Git repository, right? Or within, let's say, a same workspace. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a Git repository. It usually is like a one-to-one correspondence, but the same workspace, right? So you have everything grouped and at hand. And so whenever you work on things, you can also create relationships within those apps and libs. So you can share stuff and build up like your code base that way. Contrary to like what is called a polyrepo, right? Which is the more, I would say, like traditional approach or classic approach you would definitely find in a lot of places where there's one app, one project per Git repository, and that's it, right? And you pull in packages from the outside, so from npm registries and that kind of things.
Mhm. So instead of having like one GitHub repo for, or Git repo in general for, like your UI library, and then one for your ESLint configuration, another configuration, you might have those shared within a single repository to be able to utilize across multiple
Exactly.
different apps.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So where does NX and Lerna fit into that?
So those are basically management tools for those monorepos, right? Because you can totally just create your own scripts in the sense that you can just group apps and libs together, right? Like you start developing them and you have your npm scripts that you trigger. And most recently, actually, also like npm, yarn, pnpm. So the major like package management tools have something that is called workspace built in. So you can already build or you have at least like some basic support for monorepos in the sense you can run scripts at a high level from the root of the whole repository and trigger like a build script throughout all the applications and libs and packages that you might have in there, right? The problem is that works initially very well, but like as you scale, which you usually do, right? Because like once people usually start very small in the monorepo, which is actually a good approach, right? You start small, you have one app in there, you start splitting that app maybe up into two because it makes sense and because it's easy to share code within a monorepo, right? And that usually grows organically. So as more teams come in, they see the benefits, they start sharing, adding new libraries and packages, and so it grows pretty quickly. And being one repository means also you have then one CI process, for instance, that is running. And initially building everything on your PR might work, but like as you're in a couple months probably, and as your monorepo grows, that is not an option anymore, right? So you
Right.
you quickly run into trouble in terms of the build speed, and so again, like this becomes detrimental, right? Well,
Hmm.
initially the monorepo helps you like share features very easily and collaborate. Once your PR takes like from half an hour to an hour to build, it becomes a problem, right? Because like, people are then hesitant to make large changes. They start like trying to cram in as much as possible into a single PR, because like then obviously you shovel that over into one go into the main or mass or whatever, right? Which is again a problem, right? So people shouldn't work around that stuff. And so an X and Learner specifically come into that place, and other Monorepo tools as well. They help you with that, right? They come with features that help you just test whatever got changed in that PR, right? Obviously cutting down the time quite a lot. They come in with features like caching, which allows you not rerun every time the same computation again if you didn't change anything, and a lot of those type of features, right? So it's basically tools that help you manage those monorepos as they grow.
Right, right. Because I can imagine if you have, like, let's say 6 or 7 applications and you're building them one step at a time, waiting for the previous one to load.
Yeah,
I mean, you can
it's impossible.
paralyze that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes
It's
sense.
parallelization is basically the first big step that you usually do, and those tools have it all built in. And then next things are, as I mentioned before, like automatically determining like what got actually changed, because like so I need to just parallelize those parts, right? So maybe you have like
Okay.
5, 6 projects, right? But you just changed one library in there, and so what those tools do, they have an internal graph representation of your workspace, right? How things are linked together. And then if that
Mm,
library changed, they follow that graph upwards and see, okay, which other libraries or applications are affected by that change, right? Because they depend on that library. And so what you can do then is to say, I just need to build that small chunk of the entire graph, because like all the other things don't use that library, so they cannot be affected by the change, right? And so you already just build a small subset and parallelize obviously that run and speed up things that way.
gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. So this seems like it's an easy way to help scale production. Are there any companies that you can name that have like utilized this in their organization to be able to like scale a little bit quicker?
I mean, like the big companies that got or that made monorepos famous is kind of obviously Google, Meta now, not Facebook anymore, like Twitter. Like those are
Mhm.
known to have big monorepos. Especially Google is famous for having its huge monorepo, which is actually more or less, as far as I know, one like where everything is basically in that monorepo. The whole
Right.
company lives in that monorepo. I think they have some exceptions. I think Chrome, if I'm not wrong, is in a separate one for whatever reasons, right? But like their approach is really everything in one repo. And they have special tooling for that. So there you have a tool that's called Blaze internally, which has been open sourced as Bazel, which has all those features built in for like parallelizing stuff, for caching things, for making sure things are fast when you run them. So that's you need to have that, right? Now,
Right.
I would say, especially talking about monorepos, that example is kind of extreme. So you have one gigantic repository per organization. What we, for instance, see at now, or like when we consult and work with companies, and we have a lot of companies, Fortune 500 companies that use monorepos, that use NX, for instance, inside their organizations to create monorepos. But the reality there is more, you don't have just one, but you have a couple of them, right? And you have even the polyrepos mixed around, and even like the monorepos share parts of it to polyrepos and vice versa, right? So it's not like
Mhm.
a one thing you like, if you go monorepo you have to have one single one, and that's it. But it's more you structure them according maybe the organization, maybe according departments, or kind of knowledge areas or domain areas you want to that are kind of closely related. And your main goal is simply to facilitate the communication part, right? So you want to lower the friction when teams collaborate, because if you're in a monorepo you can just link stuff. If you're in
Mhm.
polyrepos you need to have publishing process in place, right? You have to have a local internal, probably NPM registry or some sort, and you need to have versioning schemes and stuff like that. So it's much more difficult to roll out changes, right?
Right, right. I guess my question then is like, if everything lives in one GitHub repository, I don't know why keep saying GitHub because it works for Git
Yeah,
repositories in general, right?
yeah, totally.
If everything lives within one repository, how do you manage like permissions, right? Like, let's say that I'm on team one and we want to restrict who can push to another team's code base, like, or at least be able to merge in pull requests. How do you manage something like that with a monorepo?
Yeah, usually there are different approaches. So code owner files is basically the approach that is being taken by a lot of folks, right? So you have basically your monorepo separated also in different folders, right? Folder structures. At least that's what we, for instance, suggest. Like when you set up an X with a monorepo, you have various applications, and your library or packages folder structure kind of reflects also the domain area. So you would probably have like, I don't know, you have a sales application that just has the sales part in there, a products
Hmm.
application that has the product list and stuff. Your packages might have a similar structure. You would have like a top level entry part that says products catalog or something, right? Which has then a bunch of features libraries in there specifically to that area. And so you can pretty easily then define code owner files to the level you want, right? To the depth you want, that basically guarantee that only the folks that actually are owning that piece within the monorepo, that they need to approve the PR, for instance, right? And so that way you cannot merge things into the main branch without having one of those folks having looked at it, right? So it's read on, like it's like giving, like preventing read access. That's something that's different. Like that's more difficult because you would need to kind of have some different approaches in the sense of pulling in different Git repos and have strategies like that. Most of the time that is not needed, right? Like within Compass, you want to make sure people have view access for sure. And if they want to merge, well, someone from the team needs to approve that PR and review it.
Right.
Also because it's not that, even if you're in a monorepo, it doesn't really happen that someone jumps into another domain area, right, within a monorepo and starts creating like huge changes or something like that. Those changes usually happen more often in the sense where you do the refactoring and you have a piece of library that you own that also other domain areas within a monorepo like depend on, right? And so obviously you might need to refactor those pieces as well, which is actually an advantage, right? If you think, because normally what happens is let's say I create the authentication library, right? So I have like my poly repo, I version it, whatever, publish it to my local NPM registry, and then it's kind of their job to upgrade their stuff, right? And make sure it works with my authentication library. In a monorepo, it's different because like you have the authentication library sitting there. So as I create a new branch for making changes to that authentication library, my builds on CI immediately give me feedback of whether I break someone, right? Because they are within the same repository. And so most of the times, if the breaking changes are not that difficult, I would probably even know how to fix them because I'm the one that changed the API, right?
Right.
And so this is like a huge advantage in terms of like pushing features out quickly because I'm the owner of the change. So I look at your code and I can probably tell how to change it, right? Otherwise, I will probably reach out, of course, right? I'm not going to make like huge changes, but there's a high chance that you are able to do that. And so that's a big advantage, I feel.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. I guess you touched on versioning, right? And coming from like an open source world in the times that I've used a monorepo, I've always felt that versioning can be kind of a confusing experience for people who aren't used to monorepos. Can you touch on a little bit about like how you would do versioning, specifically trying to do independent versioning of multiple different libraries within a monorepo? Like how is that traditionally done?
Yeah. So as you said, like there's different approaches in the sense that you can have the versions linked together, right? For instance, Angular is one specific example, which they have a monorepo in GitHub as well, right? Where they have all the various Angular packages, like for the router, for forms, for whatnot, right? Like, and they publish all with the same version because that makes it easy to integrate the different parts together. Because like someone already knows, okay, if I have Angular version 14, which is coming out pretty soon, right? Then I should also have the router package that is on version 14, right? Because maybe there are changes between those, but they are kind of closely related. But you might totally have, and so that case is pretty easy, right? You can use tools like change sets, for instance, to make sure to bump those versions, generate change logs and stuff. Or also Lerna is pretty popular for the publishing process because it had it always baked in. And it also managed that thing about having independent versioning schemes where each package within the monorepo has independent versions and can be bumped individually while also having it locked in, right? So they have that feature already built in. So you can, that is really up to you. For instance, NX up until now didn't really go too much into that area. So NX just makes sure that things link together nicely, you have a good developer experience in general, and you have fast task execution. So your builds and tests and linting stuff works fast, right? With the caching features and stuff we talked before. And then for the publishing process, well, you can set up your scripts. You plug in like an external tool, change sets, for instance, release it or something like that, and they handle the version management stuff. Now that we kind of took over stewardship also of Lerna, we actually also integrate Lerna into NX in the sense that our NX repository right now, the NX GitHub repo where we release NX itself, we recently changed it to the Lerna publishing process just because it made sense for us. We could first of all like experiment much more with it. And it is actually a pretty smooth release process. So you can create a Lerna script and then just delegate the actual publishing process and change log generation to Lerna itself.
That's pretty cool.
So that freedom you totally have. In general, I think like talking about NX, maybe that's also a point for some users that maybe know already a bit about NX. NX in general can be used in different approaches, right? You can have the more like I'm a company. I create a new monorepo. I want to have the best possible integration and stuff, and good developer experience. So I just create a new NX repo with some presets which we already provide. Maybe like you are a React shop, so React would be the preset you would go with. And then NX kind of configures the workspace in a way that things integrate nicely. So you have Jest, Lint, Prettier, like those things already work out of the box, and also linking libs and stuff works, right? Building, you don't have to think about that. And then there's the other approach where you're like, I have already my, I don't know, Yarn workspace setup or PNPM workspace setup. It's just slow, as we mentioned before, over time. So I just want to speed up my task scheduling. In that case, you can actually not use the NX presets templates at all. You just like install NX as a package, and it would already speed up that workspace automatically because it detects the individual package JSON files. It sees your script, which you have in there, right? Which you just have normally, and it would just run those and schedule those, right? So those are usually the different approaches. And the first one also is very much, or the one about like having different package JSON files is one that you very often see in open source projects, right?
Right.
Where you just have like a bunch of, maybe they are not even like related completely. Like you just have a bunch of libraries which you want to manage in a single repo because like you have just one CI setup and stuff, right? So
Right.
you just manage them as you did before, but you plug in an X for the speed sake, right?
Yeah.
Just that builds are fast. And the rest is basically you handle it just as you did before.
Nice. Yeah, makes sense. Studio JVLA says NX is legit one of the best tools I've used in the last couple of years.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's great to hear.
So I guess we've touched on NX a little bit and Lerna, right? Lerna is traditionally a very popular publishing monorepo tool for web developer tools. Is NX the same way? Like are either of these tools limited to just web developer tools, or are you able to say build like a .NET application or something like that within these tools?
Yeah, you totally can. So NX in general, like it has a layered architecture. So basically, the NX core part is really just doing task scheduling, right? So it does that in an efficient way with caching, parallelizing, and those things. But it doesn't really need to know what happens underneath, right? So you could totally trigger just some arbitrary script that like launches, I don't know, a Gradle script for building your Kotlin-based application, right? Or also like write something in Go, write something in .NET. And actually in NX itself, we have the plugins that we provide, like that layer on top of that core, are mostly web focused, just because now all like the business that we are in is front end mostly. Front end and also JavaScript based backend, so Node.js and stuff. So we have plugins for those. Because like, why? Simply because we build them as we consult for clients, and so this is kind of like a way to help us at the same time help clients like succeed in their development. And being an X open source, it is also obviously then available to the community at a greater part, right? But then there are also the community plugins that you can have in an X. So an X has an extensible setup, so you can write your own plugins. The plugins we write at now are exactly written the same way as community plugins. So you can just create your own. So we have actually plugins for .NET, which is pretty popular. We have one for Go also. Internally, for instance, for our internal products, we have also Monorepo with an X, and we use Kotlin on the backend together with Node.js. So you can totally hook them in. We actually wanted to have, because folks ask us for also better Java experience, especially bigger enterprise, right? And we actually had at some point a plan to actually create a Java plugin, so it's one that we release and maintain and keep maintained over time. But obviously, then again, not having that as a primary business is kind of a burden to maintain it in the long run, right? So right now we don't have anything like published out of now, but you can totally hook it in. Like you could create easily your own plugin.
For sure. We've got two comments. One of them is quote, big props for supporting Lerna end of life. And then the other one is, Redwood's still on Lerna, and we were all wondering what's going to happen with it. It was very happy to see Narwhal pick it up. So a little bit of context for those that may not be aware. Lerna was announced to be in deprecation mode from the original maintainers of Lerna. And do you want to tell the rest of the story from there? Because I'm sure you know.
Yeah, that came actually a bit out of a surprise for us as well, because Lerna, I think like Lerna has been in that kind of deprecation mode already since 2 years or so. I think like it was in 2020, August 2020 or something around that, when Lerna kind of announced, look, like the activity basically decreased quite a lot, and it was kind of a burden for the main maintainer to keep it running. Like they switched job apparently, and so obviously we all know like how hard open source can be if you're not baked by some sort of company, right? Which allows you to do it in company time. And so even at that point, we actually made quite a lot of changes in NX itself, such that you can integrate NX nicely as part of Learner. So what you could do, basically, Learner is the feedback which we get from users is like, I love the setup, I love the bootstrapping that it has, like the package management, I love the publishing process. So we use that for a lot, like that's the feedback we get. But then we hear like, but it's slow, right? So we have a large monorepo. It worked initially, but it got slow over time because the task scheduling that Learner has built in is kind of slow. It does parallelization and stuff, but it's not that advanced as like current tools that are around, right? And so what we already offered at that time is like, well, you can use your Learner workspace and just not use the publishing, use the bootstrapping and package dependency management, but use NX for the task scheduling. So we would install NX, it would detect your package JSON scripts, and the difference would be you don't run like Learner run, but you rather use NX run or NX build affected, stuff like that, right? So it is a small, like it is pretty easy to migrate, but it's still like a small thing. You need to change the commands, you need to adjust those things, right? And then like a month ago or 2 months ago, I think, someone like actually created a PR on Learner that on the README, there would be a proper big notice that Learner is deprecated, like fully deprecated, right? And so that got merged in, and so that kind of made that whole thing come up again about Learner being deprecated, being dead, and that's when we reached out to maintainer, because we felt like, well, in theory, we have a lot of experience, right? NX has been around for 5 years, so we work with tons of big companies that have monorepos, and we gained a lot of experience throughout not just developing NX, but also consulting for those companies. So it kind of made sense to help out with that, and so they agreed, and we were super happy that someone is taking it over and it's not going to die completely, right? And so yeah, that's how we came to take over stewardship of Learner. And yeah, since then we basically started looking into the code base. We actually released version 5 last week. Yeah, beginning last week, which is mainly we looked at the packages because they were super deprecated, had even security issues. So we fixed those, we upgraded those. We made it like from Learner 4 to Learner 5, like as a proper breaking change. Because some of the package APIs that we had to upgrade changed their APIs. It should be backwards compatible, but obviously just being safe and also deprecating Node 10 and Node 12 support, if I'm not wrong. It is kind of breaking change, right? It should be easy to migrate though for folks. And so going forward, the main plan is like to make the integration more easy for folks, right? So to use NX more easily as the task runner for Learner. That is actually one PR we just submitted also last week, end of last week, in which we're currently refining, which is for Learner version 5.1, which is currently in alpha. Basically, you can easily switch on and access your task runner. So what that means is like, we don't like some people got upset by that, but it's not that we try to kind of pull NX underneath into Learner. The thing what happens is Learner right now has different ways to run the packages, right? To run the tasks. It has a PMAP package and a QMAP. That those are basically external packages already, so it's not baked into Learner, how you can run your task scheduling. And so with that use NX true flag, you can opt into using NX actually, and then it would simply delegate the task scheduling to NX itself. The cool part there is obviously you don't need to change anything. So you switch on that flag, you opt in, you install NX as a package, but all the rest of the commands are exactly the same, right? It's like there is some sort of one-to-one correspondence between Learner run and NX run, right? So we just map the commands through. And out of the result, obviously, your workspace gets like super fast. You have an existing Learner workspace and gets fast out of the box, basically. So yeah.
Gotcha. So I'm curious to learn about the performance implications of like using NX, like how it's faster. But I think before we get then, I think one of the big questions that I've heard a lot is like, what's like long term, what is going to happen to Learner? Like, is NX going to kind of like phase out Learner? Like, is it going to stick around in the ecosystem as an alternative or like a companion to NX? Kind of curious about like what the long-term vision is for it.
Yeah. We have to be honest, like we have to still figure that out as well, right? So right now, Learner and NX are perfect companions, right? Because as I mentioned before, NX, for instance, doesn't have a publishing process because that's simply something we never had or never even wanted to have because we wanted to leave that to the folks to implement it on their own, right? So it is a perfect match to some degree where you can use the existing features of Learner and the fast task scheduling of NX and just pair them together, and that's it. And that's also what it will stay for quite a while. We uploaded the roadmap also last week, which you should find on the Learner repository. So there's a pinned issue, I think, or discussion. And we laid out some of the main things that we want to do, and a lot of it is around basic maintenance stuff within the learner repo itself. So adding end-to-end tests, like making the repository itself better to develop at, right? And being easier to add features, fix features, make sure security things are fixed and upgraded continuously. So this is the main focus. But as I mentioned, like we took over stewardship, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, so it's pretty fresh on our side as well. So we're still kind of figuring out what the long-term strategy would be. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just finding the links for the roadmap.
Cool. Yeah.
And of course, while I was looking for that, I came across the announcement of passing the torch, and it has I'm just seeing pages of people super excited about the announcement.
So I mean, I think it's exciting, right? Because a lot of folks, as I mentioned before, a lot of folks love their setup. They like what they have right now, right? And even though there's always kind of the urge for developers, like, let me try out something new, right? We all know like how it is in real world, like at the business side of things, right? Like if you talk about, oh, let's upgrade the tooling, or even like where it's like, let's migrate the tooling over to something completely different, like it's super hard to get the budget for that, right? Because we all know like what counts is features in the end, right? That you push out. And so I think it's a good option for folks because now you basically, the main suffering point of Learner being slow is basically away, like it's not exist anymore. And so you can still keep using it, right? And if even at some point you decide to switch to some other tool for whatever reason, right? You can totally do that, right? It's just something that you don't have to do now because having Learner unmaintained, obviously we know that security patches might become an issue at some point. Like packages are super outdated. They might not run anymore at your new platform at some point because like, node support is not there anymore. So there's a lot of things that you need to act at some point, right? Especially if someone mentions publicly on their README, look, this is deprecated. You should look for something else, right? The next security check within your company would probably say like, yeah, now it's time, right? So I think it's exciting because you can stick to what you have and you get better performance and hopefully also better features at some point. Like one thing, for instance, that I forgot about before is like what NX, for instance, has is it has a project graph, which I mentioned before, right? You have that project graph internally to speed up things. But what we do with NX is also we visualize that on a dynamic web page, right? So you can launch NX graph and it would spin up like a local browser window and you can dynamically inspect how the relationships between the projects are in your workspace. And even like do things, okay, there's a connection between node A and node C, right? So why is that? So you can click on the edge and you see the file that actually imports node C, and that's why the connection exists. Or things like, let me find the shortest path between node A and some other node in my repo, right? You see all the connections that are there. And those things are super helpful. We actually use that on the Learner repository itself to understand how Learner works. Like, Learner has also a bunch of packages in there, right? And so being it new to us, the whole Monorepo there, that was super helpful. And that's also something you get for free by opting into NX. Like by using the use NX true flag, you can use the graph now on your existing Learner workspace, which is if you want some additional feature that comes in via NX, not just the speed.
Yeah, and I assume some of that cross-language functionality in NX as well, being able to utilize that as well.
Yeah, potentially, of course, right? Like it's just running tasks, right? So once NX analyzes the dependencies, it is able to understand different languages, not just JavaScript and TypeScript, right? And potentially, like who knows, maybe at some point we even allow or make it possible to use NX plugins within a Learner workspace. So that would mean you could use an existing NX.NET or Go plugin to use in a Learner workspace and have also Go in there, right? So totally, yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So you had mentioned that NX is able to provide speedups to Lerna. How? Like what is the very biggest changes between the two that enables NX to provide that speedup?
Yeah, I think like it's first of all how the graphs are being calculated. So Lerna has also something that is called like some similar aspect of determining the affected projects, right? To just build a subset of it. But the biggest impact is obviously the caching, right? So NX has a caching built in, which means if you run a command and you rerun it for some reason, right? Again, without changing the source files, it wouldn't get rerun. So what happens is you just get the logs and you get artifacts, potential like build outputs and everything restored to their original location, but it doesn't actually run the computation. And that saves a lot of time, right? So what is the use case, for instance, for that? You might like change a couple libraries, right? That affects a subset of your Monorepo. You push it up on CI, tests and stuff run through, and it happens that at some point further up in the chain, one lib fails, and you need to refix the test and rerun everything, right? So with the caching in place, it's not that you need to rerun the entire affected graph again, but just those subset of libraries that actually are like affected by that small local change, because all the rest is basically already cached, is already there, the source file didn't change, so that can be pulled out, right? And so the advantage is mainly the caching that speeds it up quite hugely. And then there are features that you get out of that, because like with NX, what we also have is the distribution part. So the caching by default is just local in your workstation, right? So what you want to have is you want to have it primarily on CI, right? Because that's where usually the pain point is, where PRs are small to merge and like super slow to merge in. And so that's where you want to have that caching in place to actually feed the cache with new data, such that like you as a developer then benefit from it by pulling it down from what has been built on CI, but also just to speed up CI itself, right? So yeah, those are the main features, and probably the biggest. Like a lot of the other tools also have similar features of caching, right, which you can plug in. For instance, like Bazel also has it. The problem with Bazel is it's super complicated to set up. So you probably need the team to actually maintain that over time, right? Which in NX we try to make it simpler to use, simpler to adopt, more easy to go into. Because for instance, the whole caching is just enabled by default. You don't really need to do anything. And NX will detect the changes itself. It will understand when to invalidate the cache and how to distribute it, basically.
Right. So I know that we've talked a lot about using NX with like a combination of applications and libraries, right? And in particular, like multiple different applications. Is there a use case for monorepos with just one application?
I would say with NX it is, specifically because there the whole generation part of features comes in. So NX has the whole monorepo features in the sense of fast task scheduling, which we talked about. But there's also the part about those plugins that we mentioned before. They come with code generators, right? Code generators that you can plug in, and they help you, like for instance, with React applications to set up a new React app, right? Pre-configure jest for you, like set up like a Cypress test on top of that application. So all those things are pretty easy because the generators configure them for you. And so if you want to go that direction, I feel it's super beneficial. Also because you can really tailor it down to whatever you need in your organization, right? Like those generators, like we provide them in our plugins, or the community folks that create NX plugins provide them, but you can also customize them. If you can create like for your company dedicated generators that set up the component in your React or Angular application in a specific way you want to have it, right? And so I feel like from that part, it's a huge benefit. And also the other one is probably also the whole migration story. Because like if you have today like a React application, right, and you set everything up yourself, use Webpack maybe to build it, whatever, right, you need to take care to update the tooling in time, again, over time, right? Now, if you use those NX plugins, we create something that is called NX migrations. And so they help you go from one version to the next. So we know you use the plugin, you use it in a specific configuration. So we have a lot of data about how your workspace currently works. Right. And so whenever like Webpack 5 comes out or React 18 comes out, right, or now, for instance, Angular 14 is about to be released, we have already migrations in place that we trigger and make sure that your current workspace gets upgraded, which means not just package.json changes, but like config adjustments, also source code adjustments. So it makes the transition very, very easy. And this is something, for instance, what we also use when we consult for companies, right? Because if you have a large monorepo, right, or something where you have like a couple Angular applications, you need to migrate to the next version, you cannot spend months on it, right? That just doesn't work, right? Because you cannot, first of all, block development, so development will continue, and you need to do migrations as development continues, right? And so we built in those migration scripts in NX to help with that, to be able to do it like in a matter of days to weeks and not months, right?
Right. We have a comment that said something. We have used NX on a single application before, splitting components and app sections into the libraries to speed up tests and CI. Our single app ended up pretty much a shell that we imported everything into. And I think that's a great point, because like if you're able to segment out your application logic, you're able to do more thorough testing on those individual components, because you have a more concise expected input and output that you can validate against.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because a lot of the time that's actually what happens, right? Folks migrate, like use NX, for instance, and they take their Angular or React application as a piece and put it into an NX workspace. And what happens is your different features just live within folders, right? But we all know
Mhm.
folders are very loose in the sense that you can just cross import across folders. And as you get more features, that thing gets more complicated, right? And so, as the person described, a huge benefit is if you just move all those folders. Like most of the time, you can even, if it's properly organized, you can even take folders and create libraries for them, right?
Yeah.
And then what is there's a cool feature actually in X where you can define lint rules that basically describe which library can import from which other library, which
Hmm.
helps you like keep the code base sane in the long run, because you can say, okay, like something from the products feature libraries, right, can only import stuff from the products feature libraries or from something that we explicitly declared as a shared library, right? So in that case, you don't get accidental cross imports or circular dependencies and those type of things in your workspace. So there are a couple of those small little features that when folks dive into an X, usually we get a lot of positive feedback because like, they see the benefit as it as their even their local single app grows and they split it up into smaller pieces and make it
Hmm.
more maintainable. Very often it also happens that from your single app you keep splitting it up into multiple ones, right? Because maybe before you had like that one monolith which you deploy as a single piece, right? But then maybe you at some point you see, well, there's actually a public part. Like let's take the example of like an online shop or something, right? There's a public facing part, and then there might be the administrative part where you use the web application itself for managing the orders, for canceling the orders, for like processing them and stuff, right? So you can even easily split them up now in two applications, deploy and scale them independently, right, on your production environments, while still using the same code base, right? You can still share a couple of the features, and they will benefit a lot from the whole deployment story.
Totally, totally. We got a comment that says that sounds amazing. Another one that says enforced module boundaries was a lifesaver.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's a
quote,
pretty
it
good
helps
feature.
us defend against spaghetti dependencies.
Yeah,
So it sounds like a popular feature.
yeah,
Yeah, and then someone else was saying, "quote I think that having TypeScript shared with shared types between the front end and back end was great." Which I think is another important thing. Is like NX and monorepos aren't just for the front ends of your application, right?
no,
Like we
absolutely.
touched
Yeah,
on a little bit of having native code inside of these monorepos, but you can also have your server code there as well, and have shared libraries that have maybe common utilities or object mappers or whatever logic
absolutely,
you need that you can
absolutely.
share
Yeah,
between the server and backend. I know
yeah,
at least in my experience when I have built a monorepo for a single application, what has ended up happening is not just that single application, but now we need a server. Okay, well that lives in the monorepo. Now we need, whatever else, and it provides a place where you can grow and scale.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we've
I
seen all
get,
sorts of combinations there. Like also, as you said before, like maybe
Mhm.
even Swagger-based documentation on the back end living within a monorepo that generates TypeScript models, right?
Yeah.
Also, in the whole microservices aspect, like there's the backends for front ends part is very popular, right? And so
Mhm.
those make a lot. It makes a lot of sense to have those live within the same monorepo because like they are specifically made for your front end, right? So they map and communicate with the microservice infrastructure while providing service to your front end. And so having like a shared TypeScript model that goes back and forth, or using like a local GraphQL schema that you can directly refer to and generate models out of it simply makes like things more consistent because every change basically is like a transaction in the Git repository, right? As you
Right.
change your backend and your model changes, well, that's immediately reflected in that single commit, also on the front end part, right? So you can really make consistent changes, and you don't have to deal with a lot of the also communication overhead between backend
Yeah.
teams and front end teams, right? Yeah.
I've worked at a pretty big company where we had an API change in the middle of production, and it completely
Oh, wow.
broke production because it just what they didn't think that it would change the front end, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that that's a great example of where a monorepo can be beneficial. Is like if you have those tests in place, you can immediately validate whether those changes on the back end are going to impact the front end or not.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, we talked about one app being useful. What about multiple, like just libraries? Like if you're not focusing on application development, say you're building an open source UI library, is there a
Mhm.
use case for monorepos there as well?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like you can always again benefit from generators aspects, right? Like for instance, if you use UI libraries, there's integrations for Storybook. You can easily spin up those things. Also, if you create like what I often very see like with those open source libraries, you often have them. like split up, right? You maybe have a core part, especially with UI type of libraries. You have a core part that might be just doing general JavaScript stuff, right? And then you have integrations for maybe different frameworks, right? Some from Angular or for Vue, or even like different flavors, like for Material, for Bootstrap or Tailwind. And so you immediately like have that use case where you have different packages to manage, and then again you are in a monorepo scenario again, right, where you would want to have them in one place because you would want to have those consistent changes and just push them out as a single release on 10 p.m. for instance, right? So you make a change in core while you just those libraries use those core features, while there's one publishing process that increases the version, pushes everything out on npm, and you're good to go, right? So that is totally possible. We actually in NX even we have a template that is, if I'm not wrong, dash dash. Like if you use a preset TypeScript TS, we set up just a workspace with just TypeScript set up. So you can even have like that is perfectly dedicated for open source products. For instance, you have just the TypeScript linking and stuff very easily in place and very easy to spin up and release. Also support for things like SWC for compilation of TypeScript and stuff. So you can totally use that setup for open source libraries, or if you just release packages rather than having that app and lib scenario. So it's pretty flexible on that front.
Well, and I think that the other part that a lot of library authors tend to forget is that like what is the like a lot of library authors will have like, oh, please provide a minimal reproduction, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
how do you test your application unless if you have a place to test those components, right? So I think that like even if you're focused on libraries, you can still have applications in the sense of like something to spin up and implement those libraries that
Yeah.
is serves as an example application to whatever you're building, especially if you
Yeah.
have multiple different frameworks you support, you know, having a
Yeah.
Vue app versus a React app to test those different integrations.
Yeah, that's a pretty popular example. Like even having just an application to run your Cypress tests against, which uses those components, right? So you have some
Right.
sort of like safety that things are right, or even just like creating the documentation website within that same Monorepo, right?
Yeah.
Where you can already have live examples embedded because can just link those components, right, and demonstrate them live on the web documentation. So yeah.
Right, right. We had a question that was, would a monorepo work better with a team of full stack engineers for us, or would you rather have a front end back end split for a monorepo?
I think it doesn't really matter. I feel like if you have something like full stack, the thing is like, are you able to have a proper full stack team, right? Like I've seen a lot of times where it's kind of hard to have that, but I usually prefer that. Like if you have a consistent team which has like maybe there's not even just one full stack developer, but there's a mix within the team that some are more heavy in the front end, some are more heavy in the back end, but the entire team basically owns the vertical stack, right? So I think that's the perfect case where, just as we mentioned before, where you have the front end and back end in the same monorepo and you just work together there, right? So that's always perfect. But even if you have the vertical, like the horizontal split, if you want, back end and front end folks, that is usually a bit less ideal because like there is some communication overhead. Now, if you have them on the same monorepo, again, you can mitigate at least to some degree that communication overhead because, as we mentioned before, like they might run into compilation error. Like if the backend team changes something, it might not compile on the front end anymore, and so they kind of have to reach out, right, and start chatting about like, hey, what's going on? Like, how can I fix it? Maybe even, right? So it's always beneficial. I wouldn't say like there's one version better than the other, like or specifically related to monorepos. That's more in general, like if how would you want to have your software team work, right? I would
Right.
prefer like some integrated team, to be honest. But
Yeah.
it's very rare.
Well, and I think the other thing is like what I can imagine is a company that again has concerns about like, oh, well, can the back end team impact the front end team, or at least like can they code in both stacks, right? And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but like code owners is a great way of like helping
Yeah,
enforce that something is being reviewed by the right people on the right team, whether that's front end, back end, or split by feature, or however you choose to manage your teams. You can have
exactly.
enforcement on how that gets reviewed and when.
Yeah, I think that that's often a fear where like the tendency is often to restrict read access to folks, right? So make it hard to actually even read the code, right? But we are all developers in the end, right? And if my specialty is like on the backend side, I do the GraphQL exposure and Node.js or whatever, or even .NET, right? If
Hmm.
I break something and I'm in the same Monorepo and I have already the direct view access, I can actually go and check out the code, right? Like I can see it, right? I can read it probably as well, right? So I might even have a good idea where to fix it. Probably I will still like reach out to some developer that is specifically working on the front end just to make sure. But who knows? Like maybe we jump on a quick pair programming session, we fix it because like I know what I changed on the back end. He's definitely the expert on the front end side. Fix together and that's it, right? So as you said, like the code on files always guarantees that someone that owns that piece in the monorepo kind of takes a look and does the final approval. But I feel like having read access is a really facilitator in the communication, but also knowledge sharing part. Because if the repos are separate, well, I might, as a backend developer, not even know where the front end repo is like located, right? If you're in a
Correct.
bigger company, you have no clue, right? And you're
No.
probably also not going to search for it, right? Because why should I, right? So I did my part basically, that's it, right? But we all know like how that might end up sometimes then.
Right. Code handoff is such a key part of communication that is
Yeah.
so often ignored.
Yeah.
So I know that in fact, even in chat, I'm recognizing some awesome faces from the Angular community. And I know NX is absolutely gargantuan within the Angular community. Um, and I also know, surprisingly, with that fact, that the Angular CLI has the ability to do monorepos, at least within some capacity. Um, I like ignoring the extra features and the speed benefits because I know that there's a similar situation to like Lerna versus NX, Angular CLI versus NX. You know, NX
Yeah. Yeah.
provides different functionality. Is it easy to migrate away from Angular CLI if you wanted to adopt NX in your workspace?
Yeah, that's actually pretty easy. We just made it super easy last week, I think. So it's pretty new. Like we always had an automated migration script, right? That migrates over an existing Angular CLI application into an NX workspace. And what it does is basically just adjust slightly folder structures, make sure to map over some things. Because like NX has like also like jest tests and stuff. So it kind of helps you like in that migration process to some automated way. What we didn't have until a couple of weeks ago is, as you said, like the Angular CLI also has some degree of monorepo support in the sense that you can have multiple projects also in one single Angular CLI project, right? Angular CLI workspace. Their support is much less involved in the sense they leave it very much like to you. Like you always have to create a local publishable package dependent on this from that, and like it's a bit more involved in terms of using it simply because they wanted to have a more neutral approach to the whole thing, right? It's not
Mhm.
something that they said like, okay, we want to also make sure we have a very good experience in that monorepo setup, but just like we provide high level functionality and then folks do whatever they want to do with it, right? So just a couple of weeks ago, we released actually migration support also for multi-project Angular CLI workspaces. So when you have those multiple projects in there, so that should work now also pretty well. We're currently also refining some last bits. And if you go to nx.dev, there's updated docs that will help you guide through that. We should also have some blog posts coming out soon, I guess, like which also does a bit of a feature comparison. Because I feel like for Angular folks, like the transition is even very, very easy, even much easier than a lot of other, like say React folks, right? It's like the
Mhm.
Angular grew up with that CLI since Angular 2 plus, right? CLI was a
Right.
big part of that, and people enjoyed it. So they kind of are accustomed to having that support, having plugins, having like those schematics for code generation, those things. And even if you look at the commands, like NX grew out of the CLI, right? It started as an extension to the CLI. Now, basically, since already a couple of years, it is completely independent, so you can run whatever you want. But still, like a lot of the features, you can see the similarity to some degree, right? So
Right.
for
Right.
Angular folks, like running ngserve or nxserve, that's basically the difference you will hit, right? Plus, obviously, a lot more generators that we add on top of it. Like the Angular CLI, especially most recently, a lot of things have been deprecated simply because it's a burden to maintain, right? Google has internal toolings like Blaze, which I mentioned before, which they use most of the time for building stuff, right? So the Angular CLI project is more for the community, right? To bring along also the community to actually being able to use Angular projects in a very straightforward way. So obviously they don't put that much effort into it as we might do on one hand, like for instance,
Right.
providing very targeted generators for setting up NGRX, right? Or for setting up like single component application modules, things like that, right? Also, most
Mhm.
recently, we added support for micro frontends, which you can generate basically micro frontend setup for your Angular or React project, right? Things like that help you, and what we feel help a lot in the DX. And again, those things usually come out of like we have a client which wants micro front ends, right? So we look at it, it's super complicated to set up. Maybe we can find a better way. And those things kind of grow out of such engagements usually.
And
So
I
yeah, I
think
feel
that
the transition is pretty easy.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's like a key part here is that like it's not like you're building tools with this theoretical benefit that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
has this nebulous value, right? Norwal at the end of the day is a consultancy company, right? And as a result, you're building these tools from direct real world
yeah,
problems,
yeah,
right? Whether that's
yeah, absolutely.
communication problems, whether that's engineering problems, you're solving those issues with these tools that you're building, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, totally. I think we need more books on NX. Wink, Lars.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
so uh, obviously we've talked about Lerna, we've talked about NX, we've talked about Angular CLI, and I know that we've talked about Bazel, and there's all sorts of other tools out there. If someone is looking to kind of cross shop and look at the other options for monorepo tools, is there a place that you might recommend looking into stuff like that? Like how would you go about comparing and contrasting some of these different tools in the ecosystem?
Yeah, we actually created a website dedicated to that. So that was in January, I think. It's called monorepo.tools.
Hmm.
And there we basically have a list of the main tools that are around right now in the ecosystem.
Hmm.
So we try to compare like with the features that we find valuable in tools, right? In Monorepo tools specifically. Also, again, mentioned as we mentioned before, based on what we see when we work with clients, like what they face, what issues they face, right? We have like a range of tools, like a full set of tools that a Monorepo tool should basically have. Now, obviously, if you say like something like distribution doesn't matter to me, right? Because I don't need it, I have a small setup. Well, it doesn't mean that you have to choose just a tool that has all the ticks like in the comparison tables that we have on that website. But you can kind of understand, okay, what is the feature set that each tool supports, right?
Yeah.
And the site is like we created it, but it is open source. We accept PRs. We actually created. We got like I think from the Gradle folks, we got a PR that added Gradle on top of it because also Gradle has monorepo support to some degree
Right.
with also caching and distribution. Um, and there were a couple of others which I don't recall right now, which most of them reviewed as well the tools which we placed on there. Like we had Lag, we had Turbo Repo on there initially from the get go. Lerna at that point didn't respond because it was already kind of unmaintained at the point.
Right.
But basically, we reached out to all the authors, and they happily came back and contributed. Also for Basil, for instance, they came back, looked at it, like fixed things that we might have not gotten properly right. So maybe there is an integration you can add optionally, right? So even have like an exclamation mark on some pieces where it is not baked in by default, but it is easy to maybe integrate with some external tool or stuff. So yeah, that
Totally.
would be probably the best place to start. And we try also to keep it updated, right? We also
Mhm.
ping authors, like they should reach out because obviously it's hard. Like we cannot monitor all the tools to make sure that like with the latest release, maybe some of those now support those features which they didn't before, right? So that is probably the best place to go and fix it and then send us a PR to update it.
Totally, totally. Very cool. To pull back the curtain a little bit, I originally had planned a few questions of Angular, but we're actually like just about at time, and I think you've done an amazing, amazing job synopsizing the monorepo experience, what the ecosystem looks like. I think this has been fantastic. We have one last question that looks like came in. Quote, the biggest question from Angular developers, why should I use the NX CLI over the Angular CLI? What does it do other than the same?
Yeah, I think it's simply the whole effort that we put into making sure the experience is the best possible we could get, also for Angular projects, right? So with all the generation stuff, which I mentioned before, like out of the box right now, what you get with an NX setup with Angular, you have Cypress already for end-to-end tests baked in that you can add if you want, right? You have Jest tests for running. You can also use Karma, which is still supported as well. ESLint is baked in, right? Storybook generators are baked in that are also kind of optimized for the local NX workspace setup. So we do not just run the Storybook native generators, but we actually look at the source files you have and try to optimize it and even generate stories out of the existing components. And there's a lot of like modular federation, which I mentioned before, right? So I think it's on par of features like NX and the Angular CLI are basically equivalent. NX could be like a superset if you want of the Angular CLI in the sense that it provides more, right? As I mentioned before, the Angular CLI tried to downgrade some of the things simply because of maintenance issues. Like they did, at some point you run out of the capacity for maintaining stuff, right? So Protractor, for instance, is deprecated. It might get. I don't think it gets pulled out on Angular CLI in version 14, but it might for version 15. So at that point you're left without end-to-end testing, right? Which NX has, right? Similar story with like. Exactly. TS-Lint, which I think they have a migration there as well now. James Henry, which is on our team, helped out with that migration because he's very deep into the TS-Lint and TS-Lint story as well. But yeah, that's another example, right? Since we work with a lot of the companies that use exactly this type of tooling, we had huge companies that were on TS-Lint and they were kind of worried, like they had a lot of TS-Lint rules. How do we get out of TS-Lint because it's deprecated, right? And with the migration, like we kind of migrated it in one go for them. Mostly painlessly, right? Even migrating rules.
And
so it's that type of support.
And huge shout out to Josh Goldberg, who's also on the TypeScript ESLint team. I just chatted with him yesterday, and they do incredible stuff.
Yeah. No, the tooling is awesome, right? And so I feel like that's the additional benefit you get. Plus, obviously, the possibility to expand from there, right? So as we mentioned before, you might right now just think you have a single application, but once you see like the benefit of what can it do to your system architecture as you split up things, right? As maybe create from one app 2 apps, right? Or independent deployments, right? At some point, maybe you want to transition to micro front ends. Well, you have to support directly baked in, right? Which might otherwise be a bit more difficult. So yeah, that's from my perspective. But obviously I'm biased, right? So that's for sure.
Well, I mean, that's why monorepo.tools exists, right? To kind of help facilitate that initial conversation of which tools you should be looking at and what options there are out there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us. And to the audience, thank you for joining us as well. I hope this has been informative and helpful, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, it's been an amazing talk.
All right. Bye.